Well, hello and welcome to North Star Oasis. I'm your host, Jeff Williams. We're here for another jam-packed, action-filled information overload on this 14th day of November. And it didn't seem to be too long ago when we were just beginning another year. And here we are, celebrating our 5th anniversary of North Star Oasis. Yes, 5 years ago on this very day was our very first episode. This is back when we were on broadcasting out of suburban community channels in White Bear Lake, and it's been 5 years now. We're heading on to our 6th year. November 14th, 2014 was when we aired for the very first time. Wow. Anyhow, we're going to continue on because we had some stuff that happened with what we were talking about last week, and we are going to finish up, just kind of wrap up. We looked at the Kentucky and Virginia, well, we looked at the midterm, the off-year elections. But Kentucky had a governor's race and Virginia had a state legislative races. And the Democratic Party is using that as their victories there, trying to highlight how good it's going to be for the Democrats in 2020. That's what we talked about last week on the Kentucky governor's race. But yet, just to rehash, when we talked about the Kentucky governor's race, we pointed out that it was the health care and pension issues, mainly the pension issue in Kentucky, and negative advertising against Matt Bevin, the current governor, that cost Bevin his own seat. Whereas, Democrat Andy Beshear and his father, his father had contributed to the mess, and Andy Beshear took advantage of Bevin's unpopularity as it was and cruised to victory. Well, I can't say cruise because it was very, very tight. 5,189 votes was the margin of error. And here we are today as I was driving into the studio, that there's been a change in the Kentucky governor's race. I shouldn't say change, but things have come to a resolution. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is Democrat Andy Beshear declaring victory from election night. Let's take a look at this.
Tonight, voters in Kentucky sent a message loud and clear for everyone to hear. It's a message that says our elections don't have to be about right versus left. They are still about right versus wrong. As your next governor, I will listen more than I talk. I will work with anyone who has a good idea that we can deliver for Kentuckians. With all the partisan bickering and nastiness that we're seeing in politics, we have an opportunity to do better right here in Kentucky.
I just want to.
So essentially, what Beshear did is he took advantage of the political climate and failed to push. Well, you know, we'll go back to last week with the lawsuit. Andy Beshear in the lawsuit, taking full advantage of the political situation, and then he runs for governor. And yes, he just today officially became the governor. He will be sworn in sometime next month. The process in the state of Kentucky is a little bit different than Minnesota in the fact that once you have the canvass, that's pretty much the final word unless you push a challenge to the legislature. And in this case, Matt Bevin has chosen not to go that route. So here is outgoing Governor Matt Bevin on a press conference earlier this morning.
I just want to be clear. We're going to have a change in the governorship based on the vote of the people. And what I want is to see the absolute best for Kentucky. I'm not going to contest these numbers that have come in. It isn't fair to throw that on our legislature to try to find something that there just isn't. We know of some things, but not enough to cause us to think there's going to be meaningful change. So to that end, I want to be very clear on a couple things. Things that, had things gone down with different timing, we could have made these same comments earlier. I truly wish the Attorney General well as the next governor of this state as he assumes these responsibilities. I truly do. I love this state. I love this country. I love the fact that we're blessed to live in a nation where things do transition in ways that much of the world wishes they had. There's not going to be people fighting in the streets. There's a natural exchange of leadership, and we will have that.
So that's what Matt Bevin had said just a few hours ago as he concedes to Andy Beshear, the new incoming governor of Kentucky. Now, we're going to take a momentary pause for our Prager University segment because there's something more up-to-date in the PragerU versus Google lawsuit, and just a recap of how we got here. Let's take a look at that and show how big data and is influencing big government.
It started with this one email from one of our supporters saying, hey, you know, I was at the office today and I remembered watching this video last night and I wanted to show it to my colleague, but I pulled it up on my browser in the office and I wasn't able to find the video. What happened? Did you take the video down?
We first discovered that our videos are being restricted in 2016, and at the time that was 15 PragerU videos. Since we filed our lawsuit and started speaking up on the issue, not only has that number grown, it's now over 200 videos restricted. It's almost as if YouTube and Google are punishing us for speaking out and fighting back.
Dennis Prager operates Prager University, which creates videos online to educate people. He's recently sued Google and its subsidiary YouTube.
Prager University taking on big tech, the conservative group accusing Google-owned YouTube of unfairly restricting its conservative videos.
PragerU is a digital media group whose videos have hundreds of millions of views.
But the company claims tech giants like Twitter and Google are trying to crack down on them and silence them for being conservative. So now, PragerU is suing.
This story that PragerU is suing YouTube, suing Google, it might be my favorite story in the news.
56 of 320 of our 5-minute videos cannot be seen by any family that filters out pornography and violence, by every school, by every library. They can't, it just cannot be seen. It's like it doesn't exist.
If anyone has ever seen a PragerU video, they know that they're very educational and very appropriate.
We're suing them because what they're doing is obviously wrong. 1/5 of our portfolio are being either restricted or demonetized by YouTube and Google. They just, which ones, nobody knows why.
If you say anything positive about America, it's restricted. Anything positive about Israel, it's restricted. And then there are things that are restricted that I can't even figure out why.
This is why we launched an online petition that has over 450,000 signatures at PragerU.com. This is why we filed the lawsuit. Google and YouTube hold themselves out to be a public forum, a platform of freedom of expression and free speech online.
Google defines itself as a public forum, right? Its mission is to aggregate and make the world's information useful. So it's not only that we're saying that they're the biggest vehicle of communications of today and possibly of all times, right? They are saying it as well.
But then they turn around and censor ideas they don't agree with. This is why we're heading to court next week on March 15th in San Jose. And, you know, we're David, they're Goliath, but we're excited for this fight.
So, I think there was actually more to that video than, yeah, we're good. I think we got the gist of the argument, because I find it interesting here how in 2016, when there was this talk about Russian collusion and Russian bots, or Russians paid for ads through bots on Facebook, and we can't let this happen again. Well, hey, guess what, folks? What happened right after that? Oh, then the censorship of the PragerU video. In other words, are they meaning that we can't let Donald Trump win another election again? I don't know. Is that what they really mean? Think about it. All of a sudden, PragerU gets censored. Why? For explaining the truth. And we play Prager University segments all the time here. You know that if you've been a regular viewer. I love their stuff. Why? Because it's a short information piece that is able to get you some information, look at things that you may have not seen before in a positive but factual manner. That's all it does. Like a 5-minute cartoon that says, hey, this is, kind of remember those old ABC, school rock, lunch, what do they call them, back in the 70s? Schoolhouse Rock, yeah, Schoolhouse Rock videos. And you get a little information piece about the, say, the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, and it'd take a minute or two in a little jingle, and that's kind of what PragerU does. That's all. But shedding the light of truth onto that goes opposed to the narrative sounds to me like it's almost a form of electronic gerrymandering. Now, what do you mean by that? What's gerrymandering? Gerrymandering is redrawing the congressional district or legislative district boundaries to try to get what you want if you're the boundary setter. And we're going to explain gerrymandering in just a moment. But here, I think this is kind of like electronic gerrymandering of information. We want to suppress this group that we don't like, but we're going to make sure that we have this group that gets heard all over the place because that's the group that we like. That's kind of what's happening, is the gerrymandering of information that Google is partaking. And yet, now Google's a private company. They can do whatever they want, right? Well, not quite, because of the manner in which that they hold themselves and how they believe in what their role is. But we're not going to get into that because I want to use this as a transition point into this whole thing about gerrymandering. What in the world is a gerrymandering, and what does it mean for us today? Because there's actually some implications. We covered a little bit of this last week. There's some implications going on right now on gerrymandering. And so we're going to take just this time today to try to cover a little bit more about gerrymandering and how that actually had an impact last week on some of the off-year elections. So right now, let's get a crash course, Government and Politics number 37 on gerrymandering.
Hi, I'm Craig, and this is Crash Course Government and Politics, and today I'm going to talk about a topic in American politics that tends to drive people crazy! Ah! No, it's not partisanship or horse race journalism or the state of political punditry, although we could easily do episodes on all three of those, and we might. Nope, today we're going to look at the election districts and how they shape electoral outcomes, and that means, you guessed it, we're going to talk about gerrymandering. Thank goodness, gerrymandering is a blight on our American election system. It completely thwarts the will of the majority, and it's responsible for our lopsided House of Representatives. Not so fast, my left-wing sore loser friend. Gerrymandering is not nearly as responsible for the 2014 Republican Congress as the fact that people like you self-segregate into urban enclaves of socialism. All right, calm down, clones. Gerrymandering is a little more nuanced than that. Let's talk it out. Congressional apportionment, how many representatives each state gets, is super exciting, even though it only changes every 10 years. Since the number of representatives each state gets is based on population, it's important to know how many people are in each state. That's one reason, at least in the Constitution, that we have a census every 10 years. The most populous state, California, has the largest number of representatives, 53, and the least populous states have only 1. Sorry, Alaska, Delaware, the Dakotas, Vermont, and Wyoming, and Montana, and the state of loneliness. 1 is the loneliest number. In those sparsely populated states, figuring out the election district, which geographic area is represented by a congressman, is easy because there's only 1 district. This makes elections in these states effectively at-large elections, like a state's choice for senator. Even though there are 2 senators from each state, they represent the entire state at large rather than only a part of it, like representatives are supposed to do. The Electoral College, the system through which Americans choose their president, are also a type of at-large election. The rest of the states are divided into what are called single-member districts. This means that each election district chooses 1 representative. Now, you might think it would be simple to divide a state into as many pieces as it has representatives, but why would you think that? Nothing is simple. Districts are required to be equal, or almost equal, in population, and in most states, populations are not evenly distributed across the entire region. The notion that election districts must encompass equal population is the essence of the idea of 1 person, 1 vote, a principle that was cast into law by the 1962 Supreme Court decision in Baker versus Carr. It means that a person's vote counts equally no matter where they live, at least as far as the House of Representatives goes. In the Senate, it doesn't actually work out because the resident of a small state like Delaware has the same number of senators, 2, as a resident of California. To put it another way, in 2014, 2 senators represented 897,934 Delawareans, and the same number of senators represented approximately 38 million Californians. In the House, each representative is responsible for about 700,000 to 800,000 people, which is still a lot, but much better than 1 senator for 19 million Californians or 13 million Texans. The idea that people should be equally represented in Congress shouldn't be controversial, and for the most part, it's not. What is controversial is the way that minority groups are represented. One of the problems with single-member districts is that they can make it easier to cut minority groups out of the political landscape. After all, if in a given state only 15% of the residents are minorities, it will be more difficult for them to elect a member of their own group, even under a plurality rule, unless that person can appeal to a large number of non-minority people. Congress and the Supreme Court have tried to remedy this problem by mandating that there be majority-minority districts, which is a confusing way of saying districts where the majority of voters are members of a minority group. This is a little like affirmative action in the realm of voting, and as you might have guessed, there's a fair amount of disagreement among people who think a lot about it, although I'd bet that number itself is a pretty small minority. This idea of majority-minority districts leads us into a really fun aspect of congressional districting, the way that the districts themselves are drawn, a process known as gerrymandering after the 19th century political cartoon that depicted one particular Massachusetts district that looked like a reptile. Oh, there it is. Looks like a dragon or something. And we all know dragons are reptiles. The man responsible for this twisted district, the name of my band in high school, was Elbridge Gerry, hence the name gerrymander. So districts have to be drawn in a way that they contain roughly equal populations. So why does it matter if they look convoluted or even somewhat ridiculous, like this? Well, states don't just draw districts to make them equal in population. They draw them to capture certain population characteristics so that one party has a greater chance of electing a member from a particular district. In the district pictured here, the Illinois 4th, Chicago has been carved up to capture a certain population. Me. That's the district I live in. Usually, districts are drawn so that they can capture my vote, or a significant majority of one party or the other, virtually ensuring that a particular district will elect only a Democrat or Republican, as the case may be. You might have noticed that thin strip on the Illinois 4th's western edge, connecting the upper half and the lower half. Look carefully and you'll see that it runs along the interstate, which I'm sure means that it has a huge population. Why do we do this? Because one of the requirements, according to federal election law, is that districts not only be roughly the same size in terms of population, but also that they be contiguous, meaning that they can't be divided completely by other districts. This requirement results in some pretty weird configurations. So who draws these cockamamie districts anyway? Well, they're done by state legislatures. Well, not legislatures themselves, but by people working at the behest of legislatures. If one party has a majority of the state legislature, say the Democrats, they usually want to draw the districts so that Democrats have a better chance of winning. Republicans do the same thing. This is why state legislature elections matter so much in census years. Whoever wins that year gets to redraw the districts. A couple of things to note here. First, there's no rule saying that states can't redraw their districts whenever they want. Texas tried to do this in 2003, not a census year, prompting its Democrats to run away to Oklahoma for a spell. Second, it's possible for a state to hand the task over to a less biased expert district drawing person or group that might make districts more fair. Hand it over to me. I'll make them all look like little bunnies. But wait, you might ask yourself, what's wrong with this system and why do people think it's unfair? Let's go to the thought bubble. So imagine a state that's 60% Republican and 40% Democrat and has 5 electoral districts, like this one. Let's call it Clone-Sylvania. You could draw districts so that there were 3 Republican districts and 2 Democratic ones, accurately reflecting the state's population, like this. Or you could redraw it so that there were 3 Democratic districts and 2 Republican districts, which would be an inaccurate reflection of the party composition of the state's population. Or you could simply draw the districts so that you had 5 Republican districts and 0 Democratic ones, like this. So you can see, especially in the second and third examples, how gerrymandering can result in districts that don't actually reflect the political makeup of a state at all. By now, you might be fuming at the injustice of state legislatures redrawing districts to make sure that the opposing party has no chance of winning national congressional elections. And you may have read a number of articles blaming gerrymandering for the composition of the current Congress and for making congressional elections generally less competitive. There are a lot of people who feel the same way. But there's a counter-argument that it's not the state legislatures that result in solidly Republican or solidly Democratic districts, but the fact that Democratic voters tend to cluster in cities where they often outnumber Republicans by a lot, so that states like Ohio, even though the numbers of Democrats and Republicans are pretty even with a slight edge going to Democrats perhaps, they all tend to concentrate in urban areas around Cleveland and Columbus, so that the overwhelming majority of the state's districts are won by Republicans. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Congressional districting is fascinating and really important for determining the composition of Congress, but it's also quite complicated, which, as with most things, makes it difficult to understand. But unlike some other complicated issues concerning policy, gerrymandering is one that's easy to criticize because the visual results are so striking and because it can result in numbers that just look unfair. This is probably why, come election time, you'll hear a lot about it. Now at least you'll have a better idea of what those pundits are talking about, and you'll be better equipped to make your own decision about the issue. Luckily for you, there's more and more data about this stuff every election, and always more to learn. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Crash Course Government and Politics.
Okay, so he's got about 85 to 90% of that correct. Big error when it comes to the United States Senate because he forgets to mention the fact that the reason why the U.S. senators are the way they are is to give the state legislators an opportunity to have an influence on the federal process. Because up until, what was it, the 1950s, well, let me just Google that. When did senators get elected? Oh, okay. Passed by Congress May 13th, 1912, and ratified April 8th, 1913. The 17th Amendment modified Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution by allowing voters to cast direct votes for U.S. senators. Prior to its passage, senators were chosen by state legislatures. Why was that? It's to give, well, like for instance, you look at the Lincoln-Douglas debates from, was it 1858? Lincoln and Douglas went throughout the state of Illinois, and they had their famous debates, which I think were like 90 minutes long. It became an all-day affair, but that was kind of the centerpiece. Why did they do that? Because it was the majority of votes in the state legislature that would determine which of them went to Congress, went to the U.S. Senate. They had to do the stump speeches to try to get the party support for the legislative candidate. And if they could get enough of the legislative candidates from their party elected, that was how they went to Washington to represent as U.S. senators. And in the Lincoln-Douglas debate, Stephen Douglas, Democratic Party, ended up getting the majority of the state legislative seats. They are the ones who selected Stephen Douglas to the U.S. Senate. Abraham Lincoln was shut out of that process. His process was the campaign. That was how it was done prior to 1913. And that's why this whole representation for a certain number with U.S. senators is a false comparison, because it was never originally intended that way. This particular amendment to the Constitution is what changed that. So yeah, I mean, you can kind of say, well, yeah, that's the way it is now. But really, if you were to take a look at how the process was originally, and I still think that the 17th Amendment should be repealed. I think the state legislature should go back to appointing U.S. senators.
It was originally states' rights, equal rights.
Yes, it was originally states' rights, but then, in 1913, that was taken away from the states. And states ratified the constitutional amendment, so there was some, a wink and a nod there, because they did have some say in the process. But nonetheless, getting back to gerrymandering, the fact is that is the way things are chosen. And the Supreme Court really doesn't have too much to say against partisan gerrymandering. It prohibits, Supreme Court rulings have prohibited on racial lines, but not on political lines. So we're going to show you one more on short piece on the explanation of gerrymandering, abbreviated version.
When you look at this picture, what do you see? A disoriented seahorse? A ghost woman? A boomerang? This is actually Massachusetts' 7th Congressional District. And these are some other creatures, districts. Congressional districts are geographic voting areas represented by a single member of Congress. Gerrymandering happens when a political party in charge carefully slices up voting districts so that the representatives they want to win. They do this by drawing the districts around the populations most likely to support them, or splitting up populations less likely to support them, making this outline of a stegosaurus. The practice is named for Massachusetts politician and founding father you've likely never heard of, Elbridge Gerry. Yes, it's pronounced Gary. Elected to the Continental Congress in 1775, Gerry signed the Declaration of Independence. He was also very involved in shaping the Constitution, but he didn't sign that, because as an anti-federalist, he opposed a stronger federal government, believing the Constitution got the balance of power all wrong. Gerry thought the federal government had way too much of it. Gerry eventually joined the Democratic-Republican Party. Yes, that was a real thing. In 1810, at age 65, Gerry was elected governor of Massachusetts. Around this time, the United States was edging toward war with Great Britain. Concerned that Federalists might betray the country, Gerry's party decided to find ways to replace every possible Federalist in office with a Democratic Republican. This included changing Massachusetts districts from reflecting county lines to ones benefiting the Democratic Republicans. In the grand tradition of political satire, an illustrator drew a picture of one of Gerry's new districts, depicting it as a monster that supposedly looked like a salamander. No, a Gerrymander. The drawing ran in the Boston Gazette on March 26, 1812. From that year onward, Elbridge Gerry would be known not for signing the Declaration of Independence, or helping to frame the Constitution, or for being the 5th Vice President of the United States. Yeah, he did that too. Gerry would instead be known for the controversial redistricting practice that bears his name, even though we now pronounce it gerrymandering.
And there you have it. There's a brief history on gerrymandering, although I am confused about one thing in that particular video. It appears to me that the actual logo that they used for the Democratic Republican Party is actually the Federalist Party logo, not the Democratic Republican Party. And I just found that interesting that they didn't quite get that right. Now I can understand why, because somebody put it under the Wikipedia entry as the Democratic Republican Party logo, when in fact that was actually done in error, because it actually belonged to the Federalist Party. So much for that, but that was just something that caught my eye. I hope that explains things a little bit more, because something happened in June, just this past June. We're going to show you a brief news story on a Supreme Court ruling regarding gerrymandering.
Well, the court made another major decision that will impact our controls, or rather who controls our government for years to come. And it has to do with who draws the borders to create the district where you vote for Congress.
Drawing the map for political gain is called gerrymandering. Our 10 News reporter Jeff Lasky looks at San Diego's own districts to show simple isn't always best.
All's fair in love, war, and politics, right?
That's basically what the Supreme Court said today, according to USD political science professor Casey Dominguez. The judges were asked to rule if gerrymandering is legal. Gerrymandering is when the politicians in power draw the congressional district map to help their own party win elections, allowing them to choose their own voters rather than the voters choose them.
When politicians choose, the voters always lose.
There's basically an infinite number of ways to draw those lines. And so how those lines are drawn can have a big effect on the way that elections are decided.
They do it in different ways. In Maryland, Democrats are accused of drawing the map to add Democratic neighborhoods to a Republican-held district, giving them enough votes to flip the seat. They also crammed Republican-leaning areas into one district instead of spreading them more evenly among several. Republicans are accused of using the same techniques in North Carolina and several other states.
Democrats can win 60% of the vote in the state and still not have a majority of the seats in the legislature.
In 2010, California switched to nonpartisan districting, but that doesn't mean Democrats and Republicans are more evenly split.
You can see that those were drawn around communities of similar types of people.
That's why the 52nd District, Scott Peters, includes Coronado and downtown, then goes up the coast to La Jolla and makes a right turn east to Poway. That puts much of San Diego's tech and business corridor together. The 51st District, represented by Juan Vargas, goes from Imperial Beach to the Arizona border, covering all the communities that touch Mexico. And in the 50th, Duncan Hunter represents the more rural and mountain communities, from the east part of El Cajon and Alpine up into Riverside County. So what way of doing it is best? The Supreme Court says they're not the ones to decide. It's entirely up to the states. Jeff Lasky, 10 News.
Critics of the Supreme Court.
And by the way, somebody did make a font out of gerrymandered congressional districts. I'm not making this up. This is actually a thing that with all of the different 435 congressional districts across the country, somebody has actually found the districts that are in shapes of letters. Unfortunately, I found the graphic too late to be able to pull it up on the screen. But there is, it's called Gerry or Jerry, G-E-R-R-Y. It is a font created by your congressional districts, and every one is a gerrymandered congressional district. So the Supreme Court essentially now has said that we're not going to really do much when it comes to partisan gerrymandering. Over the years, there have been a lot of disputes with the Supreme Court. And I mentioned earlier, Miller v. Johnson, 1995, racial gerrymandering is a violation of constitutional rights, and the court upheld decisions against redistricting purposely devised based on race. But the Supreme Court has struggled when partisan gerrymandering occurs. Veith versus Jubileer, 2004, Gill versus Whitford in 2018, and then Rucco versus Common Cause in 2019. Ultimately decided that questions of partisan gerrymandering represent a non-justiciable political question. It cannot be dealt with by the federal court system. This decision leaves it to the states and Congress to develop remedies to challenge and prevent partisan gerrymandering. Some states have already created independent redistricting commissions to reduce political drivers for redistricting and have developed alternative voting systems that do not depend on drawing boundaries for single-member electoral districts. Just to get where we're at in the modern view of things. Because there have been a lot of court cases in this last decade. Texas, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Virginia, I think Maryland. Those are just 7 out of the 50 states. That, California, we just mentioned, that's 8 out of the 50 states that I know of. That's a lot of court cases, all over how the lines are drawn. So the Supreme Court finally just says, you know, we're not going to oversee at the federal court level the political nature of gerrymanders. See, what they do is they look at whether or not a party to a lawsuit has legal standing to push the case, and whether or not the gerrymandering case is based upon race. Those are the 2 criteria. That's what they look at as to whether or not the Supreme Court will accept the case. And now they've given us a landmark decision pretty much telling the lower parts of the federal court, stay out of the gerrymandering redistricting disputes. Leave it to the states. That's a states' rights issue. There we have it. Now in Minnesota, having gone through a number of these, they get a little dicey here, but for the most part, both parties strive to find some balance. But then again, Minnesota is a state where we're not known for rocking the boat. And by that I mean that if you look at the congressional district boundaries, the 8th district of today looks very much like the 8th district of the last 30, 40 years. The 4th district of today looks very much like the 4th district of the last 30, 40 years. There's never been a radical change, and it's not like taking the 2 downtowns of Minneapolis and St. Paul, or the 2 cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, putting them into one majority-minority congressional district, and then have all the suburbs as a 2nd congressional district, and then branch out from there. Or have a district that stretches from, say, Duluth down to Stillwater. And you know, we'll use the St. Croix Valley as a line, and then we'll come over to 694, and then over to 35E, well, to 35, and then just use that corridor from 35 all the way from Duluth down to Stillwater as the dividing line. We don't do that. In Illinois and in Pennsylvania and Virginia and Georgia, they may do that, but we don't do that here. So while in some of the legislative districts it may be that way, taking a diagonal slice across like 4 different communities and that used to have, for the most part, been their own little blocks of voters, and then just changing the composition of a legislative district entirely by blurring, half of one city with half of another, which doesn't make any logical geographical sense. Yeah, we've skewed things that way here, but not at the congressional district level. So anyhow, now going back to what happened last week in the Virginia election, we had a redistricting dispute from 2015. And it was actually in 2011 it started, up through 2015. And here is Andy Fox talking about Virginia's redistricting dispute.
Today, the state Senate adjourned a special session Governor McAuliffe called to settle a redistricting dispute without making a decision.
The governor said legislators are impossibly deadlocked and have no chance of approving legitimate congressional maps. Andy Fox is in the newsroom with more on what this means. Andy?
Nicole and Tom, what it means is the court will likely settle the matter, making sure all congressional districts satisfy equal representation, protect minority voting rights, and are compact and contiguous. This is the 3rd congressional district stretching from Norfolk, Portsmouth to Richmond. A federal court ruled it is unconstitutional because it has too many African-American voters in it, represented by Congressman Bobby Scott.
I'd like the district to be constitutional. Just tell me where the lines are. I don't get to draw my own lines. The General Assembly gets to do that, and they'll just tell me where the lines are, and I'll start campaigning.
The African-American population in the voting district is a whopping 56%. Taking 15 to 20% of those voters away and putting them into adjoining districts will give African-American candidates a better chance of winning in those districts.
Courts have ruled the lines unconstitutional. It's just a matter for the General Assembly and the governor to get together to do the work that they were elected to do. Draw the lines for the 11 congressional districts.
Drawing the lines is a political process. Republicans control the General Assembly. U.S. Senator Tim Kaine, seen here with Congressman Scott, says he supports a panel of people who promise not to run for 5 years.
And you let them draw districts, and you have it evenly balanced between folks selected by Democrats, folks selected by Republicans. Then you draw districts that aren't primarily about incumbent protection, but instead are more about really representing the people of Virginia.
But once you're in charge, you can control the voting.
Lou Ward fought redistricting, won a seat on the Suffolk City Council, even wrote a book about it.
Puseville was one of the biggest voting blocks in the city of Suffolk, African American. So when they drew the lines, they split it up so it was from 57, it went to 26. So after then, I decided to run.
I think the important thing to do is to comply with the new interpretation of the Voting Rights Act. The fact is, the Supreme Court changes the law every 10 years, and you just have to deal with it.
And it got nasty in the General Assembly today. Tonight, Republicans are seething over this. They wrote us, Senate Democrats, unconstitutional attempt to adjourn defies a federal court ruling. They adjourned, the Senate did, eliminating any possibility of a legislative remedy on redistricting. Strategically, Democrats want the court to settle the matter because Democrats believe the court will give them a better shot at picking up more congressional seats. Republicans now have 8 seats to Democrats 3. In the newsroom, Andy Fox, 10 on your side.
You see, this is what it's all about, whether or not the Democrats or the Republicans can have the majority of the state legislative delegation. So that was 2015. What happened in 2018? Well, the Supreme Court was set to hear the GOP's gerrymandering case in Virginia. Let's take a look. November 13th, 2018.
The argument over 11 House of Delegate seats could come down to the U.S. Supreme Court. Today, the High Court announced it will hear an appeal from House Speaker Kirk Cox. Cox is fighting a ruling by a lower court saying the districts in question were racially gerrymandered. He says that's not the case. CNU political analyst Rachel Bittecofer tells 13 News Now it's important the issue be resolved once and for all.
Yeah, it's very important, I think, to get this right. And I think that the eyes of the nation are going to be looking at Virginia as an example of how to go back or to re-embrace the concept of compactness and drawing these district boundaries in an impartial way.
Right now, Republicans hold a 51-49 advantage in the House of Delegates. All 100 seats are up for grabs next November. Arguments before the Supreme Court are expected to start in the spring.
So, how did the Supreme Court rule? Now, we mentioned about the case where the Supreme Court ruling allows partisan gerrymanders, but the Supreme Court actually dismissed the Virginia gerrymandering appeal. So now let's find out why.
The Supreme Court dismissed a Virginia gerrymandering case Monday after ruling the state's House of Delegates did not have authority to appeal a lower court's decision. Republican legislators were appealing a ruling that 11 of the state's congressional districts were the product of unconstitutional racial gerrymandering. But the High Court says only Virginia's Attorney General is constitutionally allowed to appeal. The lawsuit behind this case is from 2011, so let's take a look at what's happened since then. 5 years ago, residents of 12 Virginia districts filed a lawsuit alleging the state's legislature had gerrymandered district maps to dilute the strength of African American voters, which they assumed gave Republicans an unfair advantage. A federal district court rejected the residents' argument, but the Supreme Court ordered the lower court to revisit 11 of the 12 districts to see if racial gerrymandering was present. That lower district court found that race had been a primary factor in drawing the maps for those 11 districts. Virginia's Attorney General, who is a Democrat, refused to represent the appeal himself, so the state's GOP-led House of Delegates appealed that ruling to the Supreme Court. Fast forward to this year, the Supreme Court heard the House's argument back in March and dismissed it Monday in a 5-4 ruling. To be clear, though, since the Supreme Court dismissed the case on standing grounds, it did not officially rule on whether there was unconstitutional racial gerrymandering. Virginia Attorney General Mark Herring applauded Monday's decision, saying, quote, "The U.S. Supreme Court has rejected Virginia Republicans' efforts to protect racially gerrymandered districts. Virginia's elections this fall will take place in fair, constitutional districts. It's a good day for democracy in Virginia." The Supreme Court has already blocked 2 lower court rulings in gerrymandering cases out of Ohio and Michigan. Justices are set to decide on 2 other gerrymandering cases in North Carolina and Maryland by the end of this month.
So there we have it. I got worked up off the side. Anyhow, the Supreme Court dismissed Virginia because the Republicans didn't have standing. Here is what happened. For the first time since 1994, last week, the House of Representatives, or the State House of Delegates, and the State Senate in Virginia went to the Democratic Party. Both houses are majority. And I looked at I'm looking right now at the vpap.org, vpap.org, election results. Democrats picked up 6 seats in the State House. Republicans, of course, lost 6 seats in the State House. That means there are 55 Democrats, 45 Republicans, 0 undecided out of the 100 legislative districts. In the State Senate, there are 21 Democrats, 19 Republicans. Democrats picked up 2. Now, does that really sound like this really big landslide election? When a 2-seat change just happens to be enough to flip the State Senate? When 6 seats in the State House happens to be enough to flip the State House? It seems to me that the whole state is pretty blue, not blue, but purple. It's right down the middle. Half Democrat, half Republican, according to the way the lines are drawn. So now what you do is you have the old lines thrown out. You redraw the lines to benefit you. So now you get a 6-seat change or a 2-seat change in the Senate because you've had the lines redrawn by court order. That's no mandate from the voters. Shuffling the lines around is not a mandate from the voters. just like in Kentucky, what we talked about last week. In Kentucky, that was not a big mandate on President Trump because the Attorney General and all the other constitutional officers in the statewide race in Kentucky went heavy Republican. And in this case, you happen to have had more favorable districts drawn to the Democrats. The Democratic Party benefits from it. But does that change what's going to happen next year? No, because this was not a mandate on the president. This was a mandate on the use of the court system to get your way politically. Now, was there some racial gerrymandering in Virginia? I'm not going to say that it didn't happen at all. But when I look at what happened in Pennsylvania, there's huge changes in Pennsylvania. Why? Because the Democrats sued to get their way because they couldn't draw the lines. And the Republicans drew the lines. And some of them, I have to say, were pretty outrageous. And some of the lines that the Democrats have drawn were just as outrageous. But the Democrats sued to get the lines redrawn, and they find the favorable court system, or the favorable court judges to side with them. And then all of a sudden, wow, Pennsylvania lost how many seats? Let me take a look. 2018 election results, Pennsylvania. I don't want to spend too much time on this. Okay, seat change. 3 in favor of the Democrats, 3 losses for the Republicans in the U.S. House of Representatives in Pennsylvania. Now, Democrats did in 2018 bring out 55.03% of the vote to the Republicans' 44.75. So some of that definitely was a motivated Democratic base. No doubt about that. But the Democrats gained 4 seats and the Republicans gained 1 seat for a Democrat net gain of 3 seats, changing the state's representation from 12-6 Republican to a 9-9 tie. In addition, Pennsylvanians in several districts elected female candidates to the U.S. House, thus ending 4 years of all-male congressional representation in the state. That's not a real big deal for me. So the Pennsylvania Supreme Court struck down the state's congressional map, ruling it had been unfairly gerrymandered in favor of Republicans. New maps were subsequently adopted in February 2018 for use in the 2018 elections and took effect with representation in January of this year. So there were, let's see, state House seats, it was, in the House seats 50-50, popular vote, Democrats had 10-point margin. So elections are really a big deal, and so is the way that the lines are drawn. So let's take a look right now at why billionaires flood the state and help redraw the lines.
Voters in Louisiana, Mississippi, Kentucky, New Jersey, and Virginia are making their choices for state and local offices. Virginia, a reliable Republican state for 50 years, is now leaning blue. And what happens here could be a bellwether for next year's general election. Donald Trump lost the state to Hillary Clinton by 5% in 2016. The state assembly is almost evenly split. Republicans hold a 1-seat majority in both the House and the Senate. Todd Gilbert is Virginia House of Delegates Majority Leader. He says outsiders have spent big money in hopes of changing the balance of power in the Commonwealth.
The amount of money coming in, mostly from the Democratic side, billionaires like George Soros and Tom Steyer, the environmentalist, and Michael Bloomberg, all pouring millions of dollars into Virginia races to try and reshape our state and ultimately reshape the country.
1 week before Election Day, more than $82 million had been spent, making this the most expensive election in Virginia history. And perhaps more than a bellwether, this vote could test Democrat voter enthusiasm, following a blackface scandal for Governor Ralph Northam and sexual assault allegations against Lieutenant Governor Justin Fairfax. Caitlin Conant is political director for CBS News.
I think it's a sign of just enthusiasm and how much voters are fired up and ready to get out there. And I think Democrats are trying to go down ballot. We saw them make efforts in Wisconsin in the midterms, and they're really hoping to make some gains in the state legislatures.
Gun control and health care are the top issues for Virginia Democrats. The Cato Institute's Michael Cannon.
Republicans just don't do health care. This has never been one of their strong suits, and it's a real decades-long problem. It's one of the reasons we got the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, is because Republicans have paid insufficient attention to this issue.
A large turnout of pro-life voters may make a difference to keep red or purple states from turning blue. Many Virginians were outraged when Democrat Governor Ralph Northam appeared on the radio advocating infanticide. Vice President Mike Pence raised the abortion issue at Get Out the Vote rallies in Virginia and Kentucky.
At a time when leading Democrats advocate late-term abortion and defend infanticide, I promise you, this president, this vice president, and your governor will always stand for the right to life.
Pence and the president will be watching the Virginia race closely. It's a key southern state. What happens here could make a big difference not only for Virginians, but for Donald Trump's re-election chances in 2020. Gary Lane, CBN News.
So, as you can tell, there were a lot of money that was in the Virginia race last week. Outsiders, and from having worked there a decade ago, I can tell you this, that in Virginia, in case I didn't mention it last week, there really is no limit on campaign funding. And corporations are allowed to contribute. And everything is publicly reported. Every dime that comes into the Virginia election cycle. If you are a candidate and you receive money, it has to be reported to the Virginia Public Access Project, vpap.org, vpap.org. And all the campaign finance reports are there, and if you're going to, there is one cap, and that is the cap, as of 10 years ago, they capped contributions at no more than $10,000 if you are not a resident of Virginia. That's $10,000 per race. So if I wanted to contribute into the Virginia races, I'm allowed to contribute up to $10,000 per seat. Outside of that, if I was a Virginia resident, if I wanted to give $1 million to a party or candidate, I could do so, but I would go on the VPAP report as contributing $1 million to this candidate. That's, I think, a fair system, a very, very fair system, simply because if politicians are going to get bought and paid for, at least we know. Unfortunately, Minnesota and federal law both have a lot more obscurities to them, and I really think Virginia runs a better system, but that'll be a source for another day. Anyhow, we're going to take a look right now, pretty much our last major thing. We're going to take a look at voter turnout last week in Virginia's 2019 general election.
And we're working for you tonight to track election numbers across our region.
We've made the calls about voter turnout, and 10 News reporter Lindsay Kennett joins us live in Roanoke with some of those numbers. So, Lindsay, was there a theme that you noticed today for people in our general area?
There really was. Voters and volunteers I talked with had one thing in common. They want to make a difference.
Did you vote today? I did vote today, yes.
Yep. Voters across the Commonwealth.
I have not yet voted. After I finish volunteering here, I'm going to my precinct and cast my vote.
Are heading to the polls, like Michael Patterson.
Do my part as a citizen and vote and make sure that my voice is heard.
Volunteers in Roanoke City say it's been constant.
Not throngs of people, not lines or anything like that, but I think it has been quite steady.
Always someone coming and going, so that's exciting.
Compared to similar election years, the latest numbers show that voting in Lynchburg is up. 11.73% of registered voters cast ballots. Compared to the last time, 12% turned out all day. Danville is consistent. In other places, voting is down, including Roanoke City and Montgomery County, which has seen 26.9% versus 34.7% 2 years ago. And Roanoke County is at 26% versus 34% in 2017.
People don't come up for the local elections, but I know that we just can't wait until the big presidential election. It starts with our local politicians.
Whatever their motivation,
civic duty, and it makes changes for how life is around here.
I can't sit on the sidelines and complain and moan and groan if I don't get out and do my part.
Red or blue.
Every vote makes a difference. This is very important.
Now, polls close at 7 o'clock tonight. You still have about an hour to come out, so if you haven't voted yet, get out there and you can still cast your ballot. Live in Roanoke, and Lindsay Kennett, 10 News, working for you.
So there you have it. And let's see if I can quickly find... it's not going to be easy to find, so I won't worry about it. I don't know exactly what the voter turnout statewide was compared to previous. It's a record turnout for an off year, 43%. 43% in an off year election. Interesting. Anyhow, that's the Virginia election cycle, but as we head into 2020, as we know, there's going to be a lot at stake. And I'm not just talking about the presidential election and which candidate is going to get Minnesota's 10 electoral votes. I'm not even just talking about the congressional elections, since we have 8 of them. I'm talking about the legislative elections, because this is where the lines are going to be redrawn. That's the battle lines that are going to be occurring for the next 10 years. So things are already shaping up because of this thing called a gerrymander, or gerrymander. Well, last thing I have on the docket for today is the fact that it was Veterans Day earlier this week. And so we are going to leave you with the U.S. Navy Band, Gonna Build a Mountain.
Gonna build a mountain from a little hill. Gonna build a mountain, I know I will. Gonna build a mountain, gonna build it high. I don't know how I'm gonna do it, only know I'm gonna try. Gonna build a mountain, from a little hill. Gonna build a mountain, I know I will. Gonna build a mountain, gonna build it oh so high. Don't know how I'm gonna build it, only know I'm gonna try. Gonna build a heaven from a little hill. Gonna build a heaven.
Producer, I'm your host Jeff Williams. You're watching North Star Oasis, reminding you that there are 40 shopping days left until Christmas. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.